Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, as Labour gear up for their first conference in government for well over a decade, I'd like to take a look at some of the campaigns and causes which might be the more fruitful targets for campaigners now that Labour are in power. In other words, what are the causes which Labour are currently not publicly engaging in, so there needs to be a campaign, but for which it might actually be possible to get them to be a bit more open and, more importantly, actually do something about it. But first, if you'd like to be kept informed on political commentary, please hit the subscribe button. So when it comes to political campaigns, I mean, there are hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Some people spend a lot of their time championing a particular cause. And for some of those people, it's because it's very personal to them. It affects their lives. It's quite common, for example, for awareness campaigns into some serious disease to begin and be powered by people who have suffered from that disease themselves or have a loved one who has. For others, we may support a cause more by accident. We read about a lack of awareness into something, a lack of support for something, maybe just a lack of legislation, which could make all the difference. And we might, in theory, back dozens of causes, some people maybe hundreds. But the more we support, the less we can do for each one. You know, if that's the case, although we can say we support it, oh yes, I agree with this, or you can donate sometimes, or you can add your name to a petition. But if you're like a lot of people, you've got maybe some time and energy to get involved in a campaign, but there are so many to support, how to choose which to throw your weight behind? Well, there are a few factors, but whenever I think about things like this, there's two that seem to stick out for me. The first is how important it is. Like in my case, that means how many lives would be improved, especially at the deprived end of things. But different people will have their own interpretation of important. But the second factor is how likely are you to succeed or to make a difference? There are some campaigns which have existed for generations and never get anywhere. In some cases, sure, maybe those who coordinate those campaigns are just not very good at campaigning. But I think mostly it's because the aims are just not realistic, either politically or economically or for some other reason. But there's no reason not to support those campaigns if you think they're a just cause. But if we look at the sort of campaigns which aim to get the government to adopt a policy, might change the law or provide extra funding for something, or actually take some funding away, as the case may be, then the chances of success are determined by how easy it is for that government to provide what you're asking, and how much the aims align with their beliefs. Like the Telegraph, for example, banging on about VAT on private school fees. They're not going to get the government to change their mind on that one. And there are several causes where Labour are currently not really saying, like noticeably not saying anything about it right now. And yet, causes that are also entirely aligned with Labour thinking. And I mean of the Labour leadership as well. So it's really just a case of finding a way to make enough noise, make it politically and beneficial to engage with. And I think the first would be a bit of a heated battle going on in healthcare. There's a lot of dodgy practices going on with physician associates. Now, these are healthcare professionals. They're trained, but nowhere near the standards of a doctor. But there are fears that too often these PAs are actually doing tasks that should be for doctors, and not even telling patients that they aren't a doctor. There are concerns that the GMC conducted a public consultation earlier this year, but are refusing to publish the findings. Now, why would that be? It's many months since the consultation ended. No obvious reason for the delay in announcing results, unless, of course, the results are uncomfortable for them. Now, there's nothing wrong, of course, with having some tasks carried out by people with less training than a doctor in order to make the NHS more efficient. You know, we don't just have doctors and nurses and paramedics. There's a whole raft of medical professionals that carry out certain tasks for which they are adequately trained. Where we've got a problem is where these PAs seem to be carrying out tasks for which they are not adequately trained. And the worry is that what we're seeing here is the result of the Tories wanting to plug gaps in healthcare on the cheap. You know, so you get a load of people who won't be paid as much as a doctor and, you know, don't need as much training as a doctor. It's like a couple of years as opposed to like 5 or 6. But this will lead to poorer outcomes for patients. That is the point. And unlike the Tories, Labour care about those outcomes because they believe that a fit and healthy population helps to grow the economy, and that in actual fact, timely and effective healthcare is cheaper than doing botched jobs just to tick a box where you then have to rectify the problem later on when it actually wasn't fixed. Second might be helping the excluded from 2020. Now, these are the people who were shut out of COVID furlough and similar support schemes. Discussed this with the main campaigners just before the election. And it's not just that these people were denied support in 2020. Many of them are suffering even now. Lives are literally at risk. People are being made homeless. Relationships are failing. All as a direct result of what Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, admitted to the House of Commons was a political choice on his part. And more to the point, it was a political choice that Labour, under Starmer's leadership, were very clear that they opposed. The campaign is asking that some of the money that Labour is seeking to recover from furlough fraud be used to help those who were put in dire financial straits by this political choice that the Tories made and Labour opposed. And I said myself quite a while ago, I thought Labour would have been mad not to have jumped on this platform at the election. I mean, imagine having as a marquee policy a way of using some recovered funds to help those people, many of whom are freelance contractors and who would have voted Conservative in the past. I mean, it was a no-brainer for me. With one policy, you not only demonstrate that Labour are providing a safety net for those the Tories abandoned, but you also get to keep going on about the industrial levels of fraud which the Tories oversaw in government. And yet, Labour don't seem to see it that way and are doing their best to ignore the issue. But this is one where I think a loud enough voice to force them to say something is unlikely to get them to just dismiss it. After all, Labour has policies to finally put a lid on a whole raft of historical injustice scandals. Well, the excluded is an injustice which is setting itself up to be a future historical injustice scandal if something isn't done about it sooner rather than later. Third, I think, would be Russian interference. Labour have absolutely no reason to want to ignore this, but that doesn't mean to say that there isn't a risk. With so many fires in the country in need of extinguishing, there will definitely be things that Labour intend to deal with, but they'll triage effectively in terms of urgency. And some things will get left on the to-do pile as more and more comes in. But protecting our politics and media from any foreign interference, but especially a foreign government, which is an actual enemy, will also help deal with any number of other problems. The worry when it comes to Russian interference is not that the government don't think it's an issue. They clearly do. It's that the government ends up dealing with the outcomes as the more urgent situations, such as misinformation on immigration and net zero, for example, without ever dealing with the root cause of the spread of this misinformation, as well as the dodgy funding which makes its way to bad faith actors in our own political system. For example, there is a bit of a focus on what social media companies need to do to clamp down on disinformation. But what about all the Russian bots that flood those social media sites? Why aren't we doing anything about those? And then there's another umbrella type issue as well, something that causes a whole host of other problems. But because people don't always see the direct link, we end up ignoring it and just dealing with the problems it causes rather than the root. And that, of course, is Brexit. As a direct result of Brexit, it's harder, for example, for the NHS to get sufficient supplies of drugs it needs. And when they're more expensive as well. That means extra costs for a health service in dire need of investment. It means businesses lose out on customers because, for many small businesses, the costs and processes of exporting to customers in the EU single market, not feasible. It hits businesses who only sell in their own market as well because it becomes more difficult or expensive, or both, to import supplies or components. Or maybe someone else in their supply chain is struggling. So there are some business models which are now no longer feasible just because of Brexit. And that in turn limits the number of businesses that we can realistically sustain in Britain, which limits the number of decent jobs, which limits people's incomes, which limits their spending, especially as most things cost a lot more now, which means that even businesses not reliant on EU trade suffer because fewer people are buying their goods or services because they can't afford to. And although I do point out that we have absolutely no option to just join the single market, and you won't find a single EU policy expert saying that this is what Labour should be doing, because it's literally impossible. What they could do is start being a bit more honest about the damage that the Tory Brexit did. Because Labour are absolutely happy to say that the Tory Brexit deal was very bad or very thin. They never say exactly why, do they? What was it about it that was bad? We should have an economic impact assessment for Brexit. Labour are happy to point at the hole in the country's finances and say, Tories did that. So why not tell people that the reason they can't get medicines easily, Tories did that with their Brexit? Or why things cost a lot more, Tories did that. Why the supermarket shelves are very often empty, Tories did that. Why there's certain things we can't get anymore. Why businesses are folding. Explain just how many businesses are folding compared to how many used to fold. You know, they can still say there's nothing to be done about this right now, which is only true in the short term, but at least let people know what's going on. Nobody would blame Labour for it. After all, they argued against it. And many more will understand just how much the Tories sold us all down the river. So those, I think, are 4 campaigns which Labour, they're not wanting to talk about right now, but you know, in terms of their political beliefs, they'd like to. There's something stopping them. They're all ones where I think a big enough noise would get a useful response. There are others as well, I think, but I think those 4 do have a path to a useful outcome with enough people asking the right questions, putting their shoulders behind those campaigns. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe as well. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.